Hi there, and welcome back to Riella's Army of Dolls, where I talk all things fashion doll. And today I'm delving into the world of one of the tallest girls out there, Evangeline Ghastly. You can see a couple of examples of her here behind me, and I'm going to be showing you a few more in a sec. Evangeline Ghastly is another Robert Tonner doll, but she is a big one, measuring about 18 inches tall. But there are a few variations of her that we're going to be having a look at, and so the height does vary depending on which doll. Now, Robert Tonner is one of my absolute favourite designers out there, probably forms the biggest part of my whole collection is Robert Tonner dolls. And one of the reasons for that is just the enormous variety of them that have been produced. And Evangeline Ghastly is an example of that, because her aesthetic is just so different from all of the other dolls. And I guess a little bit more in line with something like a Monster High doll aesthetic. She's very tall, she is very slim and willowy, she has a slightly larger head with a little more cartoony style. She has a really gothic, historic, Victorian feel to her. Evangeline Ghastly was first released in 2007 with a resin version of the doll, cost $450 US. She was released under the company name Wilde Imagination along with the Ellowyne Wilde dolls. All of the dolls from that line are really known for their gothic, demure aesthetic, but Evangeline Ghastly is actually quite different again from Ellowyne Wilde, with her super long gowns very much harking back to that Victorian historic feel. Until 2009, all of the Evangeline Ghastly dolls were released with the resin body, and the price range was pretty similar, ranging from about $400 to about $475, depending on which doll you were buying. Then in 2009, the vinyl doll was introduced. This provided a more affordable option for collectors, with prices at around $225. The vinyl doll didn't supersede the resin doll, but they continued to be released side by side, with that resin doll really hitting that high-end collector market and the vinyl doll providing that more affordable option. She continued to be released until 2011, when she was superseded by the plastic doll. Now, when it comes to the difference between the dolls, the difference between the vinyl and the plastic is probably one that the fewest collectors are aware of, but actually it's really significant. I'm going to be looking at that in just a sec. From 2012 to 2016, the doll was released with her all plastic body, along with quite a few friends as well. That was when we saw the introduction of Parnilla and Angelique with that same body. There's also a male doll in the line. In 2016, the Wilde Imagination Company did cease production, but in 2018, when Robert Tonner rebranded as Finn and Aero, he did release just one more Evangeline Ghastly. She was called Drop Dead Bread, and she's the only Evangeline Ghastly who's ever been released on the RTB 101 body. And I don't have that doll to show you today, but I will show you my Ellowyne Wilde doll who comes with that RTB 101 body, so you can see the whole range of styles that are available in the Evangeline world. Now let's go and have a closer look at those bodies and how they are different. So here lined up, we can see the 4 different bodies available for Evangeline Ghastly, and this is what I do want to focus on today. The first body is the resin body, the second body is the vinyl body, third we can see hard plastic, and fourth, as I said, I've got my Ellowyne Wilde who has the RTB 101 body. The first and very obvious thing to note is the height difference. The hard plastic is really significantly taller than all of the other bodies, who are actually pretty close. RTB 101 is a little bit shorter, but if I put her beside the 2 first ones, you would be able to see that she's actually only fractionally shorter than them. Whereas the hard plastic doll, who rates as an 18-inch doll, whereas the others are considered 16.5 or 17-inch, is really quite a lot taller. Nonetheless, at least in theory, all the clothes for these dolls are meant to fit each other. I do find, generally speaking, that Evangeline Ghastly clothes have a fair bit of stretch in them, and that does help. Now, I'm not going to be spending much time focusing on the RTB 101 body. I have already done a video about that, which I'll put a link to if you would like to go and watch that one and find out a little bit more about it. But also, there's only one Evangeline Ghastly available with this body, and she is considered a different doll line since she's released by a different company. So my focus is going to be on the other three who've been all released roughly together and with the same aesthetics and concepts behind them. So moving to just these three, as I said, the height is significant. If I line them up there with their feet roughly in the same place, you can see that the resin Evangeline is about a centimetre or half an inch taller than the vinyl, and the hard plastic is about that again, maybe nearly a whole inch taller than the vinyl doll in the middle. We can also see that aesthetically there are some really significant differences. So the most obvious is the torso and the jointing. So the hard plastic one, she has a joint below her bust and a joint above her underline, whereas the other two dolls have a waist joint. In terms of the sculpting and shaping, these two are very, very similar. They are not identical, and the resin doll looks just a slightly bit larger, pretty much all over. This doll, aesthetically, she is quite different. She has a fairly different bust shape, and she has a much longer torso. In terms of the height difference, most of it is in the torso. So if I line those up, you can see that still we've got that significant height difference. It is also a little bit more in the legs as well. So that's the most obvious difference, but there are some other significant ones. If I move towards the hands, I was quite interested to see that the resin hand is completely different from the vinyl hand. The vinyl hand is quite small and neat and dainty, whereas the other two dolls are much, much closer. And they have these very large cartoony hands. That does go with Evangeline's aesthetic, which I see as a fairly cartoony aesthetic, but this doll has these quite dainty, neat hands. She also has an extra joint above her wrist that is maybe to help with posing or probably just to help with her stringing style, but it is there. And the resin doll also have that because she is a true ball jointed doll. Moving down to the doll's legs, we can again see that the overall aesthetic between the first two is very similar. We've got the same jointing style at the knees and the same shaping of the legs. This doll's legs are a little bit longer. We have this double joint in the knee and we have an ankle joint, which the resin one also has, but the vinyl doesn't. Please note that resin dolls are pretty much obliged to have joints at the ankle because they have to have somewhere for the hook to go to hold the elastic, whereas plastic dolls don't, so that is a choice. Personally, I'm not particularly fond of jointing in plastic dolls' ankles because you can get such little range out of it that it seems to me to just add an extra point that could break, but that is a choice that we've put in here. The other thing that's interesting to note is the foot size. The resin and plastic feet, although the legs looked more different, are very, very close in size, whereas the vinyl foot, like the hands, is actually significantly smaller. So we're not actually going to be able to share shoes with the vinyl doll from either of the others, which is going to make dressing her a little bit harder. We've also got obviously different jointing styles that allow for different posing. But interestingly, all three dolls have roughly the same capabilities with the knees. Because the resin doll is not double jointed, these are single resin joints, she can't really do a whole lot more than either of the others. And they actually have a pretty good range of motion in the knee, both of them. When it comes to the elbow joints, we see exactly the same differences here. We've got the single jointed elasticized joint for the resin doll. We've got this sort of ball hinge inside the vinyl doll, and we've got the double jointed plastic joint in the plastic Evangeline. Here we see a much bigger difference. The resin BJD actually has quite limited motion. It's pretty much on par with the vinyl doll, but she holds a little bit better because her joint is nice and stiff. And the plastic doll with her double jointed elbows actually got an incredibly good range of motion, probably one of the best I've ever seen in a plastic doll, in fact. When it comes to the torso joints, again, we see pretty much the same difference. The resin doll, she can move quite a bit, but she struggles to hold that pose. The vinyl doll really has a very limited range of movement in the torso joint, and she can't really hold it there because of her weight. The plastic doll with her two joints and the plastic hinges actually moves really well this way. I would say, though, this is one of the weak points for the plastic Evangelines, as I've seen quite a few of these dolls with broken internal joints, because as they get moved, they start to get brittle and then they do go. Final jointing and posing capability that I want to talk about is the legs and thighs. Now, obviously, BJDs are elastic strong. They have round joints here. They can move nearly as much as you want them to, both forward and back and to the sides. The vinyl doll is a really interesting doll in terms of how she is put together. We'll talk about that a little bit later, but she is also got elastic here and a round joint, and so she has extremely similar moving capabilities there. The plastic doll has a hard piece of plastic there. It really can't move at all. So despite the fact that her joints are round, her capabilities side to side are nearly non-existent. She can move forward and back. The other thing is, again, the joints in here are quite brittle and weak, and if you push them too much, they may break. So that is a really significant downside to this doll. The materials of each of these dolls have very different weights and consistencies. Resin Evangeline is quite heavy. She also has a very, very smooth feel. It's hard to really describe it, but sort of like very polished porcelain. The vinyl doll is a little bit lighter, but still fairly heavy. She is smooth, but not as smooth. There is a roughness, especially to her legs. She doesn't have that sort of finished, varnished feel. Plastic Evangeline is by far the lightest, even though she is much bigger. She feels plasticky to hold. I don't think I need to describe it too much. It just feels like plastic. In terms of the jointing and overall construction of these dolls, I have mentioned a few times that this is a BJD, and she absolutely is. So she is ball jointed. So the resin doll, you can take off her head cap, and she has all the features of a resin BJD. You'll see her head hook. You'll see that she has putty in there to hold her eyes in place. She is 100% strung with elastic. So that hook attaches to elastic, which runs through her whole body. There'll be a second piece of elastic going from her arms across her torso and attaching them together and hooking at the ends to her hands and the whole body piece into her feet. And so each of her pieces is held together solely by that elastic. The plastic doll is fully hinged. So every one of her joints is a plastic hinge. That does create a weakness in this doll, that each one of those hinges is essentially a point that can break, and you do have to be careful of them. Whereas a resin doll, she is intrinsically a little bit more fragile in that the resin itself can break if she falls off the shelf, but her joints are completely secure, and that is both a good and a bad thing about her. A vinyl doll is a really interesting piece of construction because she is almost half and half between them. We'll find that some of her joints are strung with elastic and some are hinged. So her elbows and knees are full hinges. They're quite solid and they are internal. So I don't feel that they are particularly weak points because of the way they have been done. Very interestingly, these string to elastics which hold on certain parts of her body. So her hands are elastic strung up to her elbows. That means that in theory, you can remove her hands, you can change that elastic. I do think it's fairly challenging to do because it is internal, but in theory it can be done. Like her hands, her legs are also jointed at the knees, but then strung from the knees up to the waist, going through her torso and then hooking inside. So we have partial elastic and partial jointing. And this is a really interesting doll construction, one of the few I've ever seen like that. It does mean that she has quite a hardy feel and that her joints are really quite flexible, which is quite nice to do. For the doll's heads, obviously, a BJD, again by its nature, has to have a wig. We don't implant hair into those dolls. Whereas the others, these two are both rooted. It's quite common to find rooted vinyl dolls. It's quite common to find rooted plastic dolls. They can also be made with wigs. If you're considering a purchase of a second-hand Evangeline Ghastly doll, just be aware that not all sellers actually know the difference between the bodies, especially when it comes to the vinyl. You will often hear the plastic doll referred to as vinyl because vinyl is considered a better product. And in my opinion, it absolutely is. When it comes to these dolls, the resin is obviously the premium product. Just note that these dolls do go yellow. That is one of the common problems of resin. You can see that mine is just slightly yellower than the others, and that is because of her material. That's her biggest flaw in my opinion. Otherwise, it is a great product, but because of the nature of the jointing, these ones don't actually pose that well. Personally, my favorite is the vinyl Evangeline. The body has a really nice feel and has a good balance between posability and construction quality and feel. We do still get with this vinyl certain problems with discoloration. You can see that different parts of mine have slightly different colors, and that is very common. When it comes to the plastic Evangeline, she has the best posing but the worst durability. These dolls will very often break. I've had several of them arrive broken, whereas that has not been the case for any of the others. She also is simply the least attractive in my opinion. I find the body personally a little bit ugly, whereas the other two I actually really like. They're not hyper realistic, but they have a nice playful feel to them. That is, of course, personal opinion. All of these dolls, be aware, because of the nature of the Evangeline Ghastly line, come very commonly with staining. You can see some staining on my plastic Evangeline here and a tiny bit on the hand here. All of these products pick up staining. You can see staining on the head of the resin doll. And the clothing of Evangeline Ghastly dolls are very dark colours. They're not always well protected. Even my RTB 101 body, she has actually been wearing the drop dead red Evangeline outfit, and that's why she has plastic on her arms, because even it has really quite stained her. So if you're looking for a secondhand doll and you are concerned about staining, you may want to ask the seller. Although there have been a lot of different variations to Evangeline Ghastly, I think what really stands out and what brings this line together is that it has maintained that authentic aesthetic right through whichever version of the doll you are getting. That gothic appeal, beauty and historic charm mixed with this kind of drab and ghostly appeal is what really makes this doll special. You can even see it in her face. Although I have referred to her as cartoon before, I also think that she has been significantly influenced by that concept of ghosts, mummies, the afterlife that a lot of our pop culture is filled with in both her sculpting and her makeup design. The clothing is really exceptional and exotic. Everything is over the top. Everything is long, flowing, and with these little details that you pick up as you look closer. Although this line is most definitely not going to appeal to everybody, in terms of the detail and styling, there are so many exceptional things about Evangeline Ghastly that runs from the first doll to the very last. Just make sure that if you are buying one of these dolls from the secondhand market, that you do a little bit of your own research, because not all sellers really know what they are selling.